The story of Russia's economic downfall is not sudden. It is not a lightning strike in a clear sky, but rather the slow cracking of a giant glacier, breaking apart piece by piece until the collapse becomes inevitable. Today, as the world looks at Russia, one of the greatest ironies unfolds. A nation sitting on some of the largest reserves of natural resources, especially oil and gas, is on the verge of industrial ruin because those very resources are now strangling its future. The West once depended on Russia for energy. Europe, in particular, was tied to Russian oil and natural gas pipelines like veins carrying lifeblood. For decades, Moscow believed this dependency gave it an untouchable advantage. But history moves faster than dictators imagine. When the war in Ukraine broke out, sanctions tightened like a noose. At first, the Kremlin laughed them off, boasting that Russia would redirect its energy flows to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For a while, it seemed to work. Ships laden with crude oil sailed toward India and China. Moscow tried to spin the narrative that sanctions were ineffective, that Russia had found a way around them. But behind the confident speeches, cracks began to widen. The heart of Russia's economy, the oil industry, was built not just on wells and pipelines, but on technology, global finance, and partnerships that Moscow never fully controlled. The West supplied critical drilling equipment, advanced software, precision machinery, and even the massive tankers that carried Russian crude across oceans. When sanctions cut these ties, Russia faced a silent but devastating problem. It could pump oil, but not sustain its industry long term. Let's begin at the ground level, in the oil fields of western Siberia. For decades, the fields around Tyumen, Surgut, and Khanty-Mansiysk have been the backbone of Russia's energy empire. Wells drilled deep into frozen tundra, pumping millions of barrels of oil a day. But those wells are aging. Many of them require enhanced oil recovery techniques, sophisticated methods like hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and chemical injection. And here lies the first crack. Much of this technology came from Western companies such as Halliburton, Schlumberger, and Baker Hughes. Once they pulled out of Russia, the country's oil engineers were left stranded, forced to improvise with outdated Soviet-era equipment. Russian officials tried to downplay the loss. They claimed their scientists could develop alternatives, that domestic technology would soon fill the gap. But oil is not forgiving. Wells drilled incorrectly collapse. Pipelines corrode. Extraction slows. And the decline, though gradual, is relentless. By mid-2023, Russian oil production had already started slipping. Official statistics tried to paint a rosy picture, but independent analysts, using satellite data and shipping records, revealed the truth. The industry was shrinking. Exports were becoming harder to sustain.
And even discounted sales to India and China could not hide the downward curve. Then came the second blow, shipping. Transporting Russian oil is not as simple as filling barrels and sending them east. The West controls much of the global shipping industry, from insurance firms based in London to massive tanker fleets owned by Greece. Sanctions specifically targeted these arteries. Tankers carrying Russian oil without approved insurance found themselves stranded at ports. Some risked sailing without insurance, but that raised the danger of catastrophic accidents. No country wanted uninsured Russian tankers near their coasts. To bypass this, Moscow cobbled together what became known as the Shadow Fleet, aging vessels bought secretly, registered under obscure flags, and operated with minimal oversight. At first, this seemed clever. Tankers quietly carried crude to India and China. But over time, cracks emerged again. These ships were old, many decades past their prime. Engines failed, hulls corroded, and accidents multiplied. Each accident raised insurance costs further and scared away potential buyers. Suddenly, Russia found itself not only selling oil at a discount but also spending fortunes just to get it out of its ports. And the buyers themselves began dictating terms. India, now Russia's largest oil customer, realized its bargaining power. Why pay $80 a barrel when Moscow was desperate to sell at $50 or even $40? China followed the same path, squeezing Moscow further. Once proud of its role as an energy superpower, Russia now looked like a desperate vendor in a collapsing marketplace. But the biggest crisis was still to come. Oil, at its core, is not just about selling barrels. It is about sustaining the infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, storage facilities, and above all, investment. Without international partners, Russia's oil giants like Rosneft, Lukoil, and Gazprom Neft faced a funding freeze. Western banks refused to lend. Asian banks, cautious of secondary sanctions, hesitated. Projects to explore the Arctic shelf or to develop deep-water drilling in the Caspian Sea stalled. Billions of dollars evaporated. Even more devastating was the exodus of skilled professionals. Thousands of Russian engineers, economists, and managers, many trained abroad, fled the country after the war began. Without their expertise, the industry became less efficient, more bureaucratic, and more corrupt. Mismanagement grew. Profits shrank. By 2024, analysts began speaking openly. Russia's oil lifeline was bleeding out. The decline was no longer theoretical. Fields in Siberia showed falling output. Refineries reported shutdowns due to lack of spare parts. Tanker accidents in the Black Sea embarrassed the Kremlin further. But why is this so critical? Because oil is not just an export, it is the foundation of Russia's budget. Nearly half of the government's revenue comes from oil and gas. Every ruble that funds the war in Ukraine, every pension paid to citizens, every infrastructure project, it all begins with oil. A decline in production means less revenue. Less revenue means higher deficits. Higher deficits mean printing money, which fuels inflation. And inflation is the silent killer of empires. In Moscow, prices for basic goods began rising. Food shortages appeared in some regions. The ruble lost value rapidly, forcing the central bank to hike interest rates. Ordinary Russians, once shielded by government subsidies, started feeling the pain. Discontent grew, not openly, because dissent in Russia can mean prison, but quietly, in whispers, in long queues outside grocery stores, in families wondering if their children had any future left. Meanwhile, the Kremlin doubled down. Propaganda on state television painted a picture of resilience. Officials claimed Russia was turning eastward, building a multipolar world. But the truth was unavoidable. No matter how many speeches Putin gave, the numbers told a different story. Oil revenues, once a torrent, had become a trickle. And in the background, sanctions continued tightening. The European Union expanded restrictions on refined oil products. The United States cracked down on companies helping Russia bypass sanctions. Even Turkey, once a key partner, started pulling back under Western pressure. The Russian oil industry, the lifeline of the nation, was suffocating. In the coming years, experts warn, this decline will accelerate.